The line at customs had been moving for 3 hours before it stopped entirely. I noticed it the way you notice a train slowing, not all at once, just a gradual drag on the momentum, a subtle shift in the ambient noise, and then the stillness. 80 meters of queue ahead of me, all of it frozen. Beings of a dozen species, each holding their transit documents in whatever passed for hands, all of them very carefully not looking at the processing booth at the far end. I looked. The booth was occupied by something large. Matte black carapace, 4 arms, a head that swiveled on a neck like a gun turret. 2 of its arms were managing a console. The other 2 were folded in a posture I'd come to associate, in my 6 months on the HFY way station corridor, with bureaucratic displeasure. The being at the window, a Solhari merchant, triple-lunged, iridescent scales picking up the overhead light, was saying something very quietly. The officer responded without looking up from its screen. The Solhari left the window moving fast enough that the queue shuffled backward to let them through, which was saying something given how packed it was in here. Then the officer called the next traveler. The line moved again. I shifted my bag on my shoulder and exhaled. My feet had been hurting for about 2 hours. Transit queues on HFY's Class II way station were designed for a range of species, which meant they were designed for no particular species, which meant the floor was an uncomfortable compromise that worked tolerably well for beings with 4 or more legs and progressively worse for the bipedal contingent. I'd been standing for most of 3 hours. I'd brought a protein bar from the ship's commissary and eaten it at hour 2. I was tired, my feet hurt, and I had a connecting ship to catch in approximately 6 hours. My name was Marcus Calloway. I was 37 years old, an independent freight auditor contracted out of the newly ratified Earth Transit Authority, and I was standing in an alien immigration queue on a way station 40 light-years from home. The passport in my breast pocket was a slim blue booklet stamped with the new unified seal, the olive wreath, the stylized trajectory arc, the words United Earth in 12 languages including 2 that weren't human. The Telhari script on the back cover always caught my eye. It looked like someone had tried to write cursive using only right angles. The designers had spent 18 months on the visual language. The printing contract had taken another 4 months to award. There had been a ceremony when the first batch was issued. I'd watched it on a 2-second delay live stream from my apartment in Toronto and thought, we're doing this now. 2 years later, I was doing this now. 40 light-years from home, in a queue that smelled of ozone and something sweetly chemical I'd never been able to identify. I'd asked 3 separate people and gotten 3 completely different answers about what species was producing it and why, holding my little blue booklet and waiting for my turn. The line moved. I'd been watching the customs booth for the better part of an hour by then, the way you watch anything when you're standing in a line with nothing else to do. The officer's name, according to the placard mounted above the booth in 3 Concordat scripts, was Prathysval. Rank, Senior Customs Adjudicator, Class IV. The species was Karathan, one of the 2 founding races of the Concordat, old money in the interstellar sense, old enough that their bureaucracy had its own bureaucracy, which had its own internal review committee, which published quarterly reports that almost nobody read. Prathysval had been processing travelers at this particular booth for what I'd been told was the equivalent of 40 Earth years without interruption. I'd been told this by the Solhari merchant, who'd come to stand beside me in the post-processing area, and was now examining the ceiling with the intensity of someone who'd decided the ceiling was the most interesting thing in the room and was going to commit to that position. What was that about? I'd asked them, not being nosy, being a freight auditor. It was a professional condition. My transit permit had an irregularity, the Solhari said. Their voice was produced by a secondary throat structure and had a resonant, doubled quality, like 2 people speaking in close harmony. A formatting issue. My species uses a different calendar notation for the date of issue field. The day-month sequence is inverted. They cleared you, though. They did not clear me. They told me to stand in the secondary queue. They paused. There is no secondary queue. That is a figure of speech. Meaning I am now persona non grata on this way station for 90 of your Earth days, pending a review that will not occur. They finally looked at me. Their secondary eyelids were doing something expressive that I didn't have vocabulary for. Are you traveling on an Earth document? I am. Something moved in their expression. I'd gotten better at reading Solhari faces over 6 months in the corridor. The gill-fold tension, the secondary eyelid deployment, the slight iridescent shift that meant, approximately, emotional processing in progress. This one had the look of a person watching someone else walk toward a glass door. Good luck, they said. I thanked them. The line moved forward. I reached the window. Prathai's vow didn't look up immediately. This, I'd learned from 6 months of transit through Concordat-administered hubs, was standard Karathan processing protocol. They finished whatever notation they were entering on the console, touched 2 keys in a specific sequence, then rotated the upper section of their torso to face the window. The face, if you wanted to call it that, was a cluster of sensory organs above a mouth that had evolved for filter feeding and now mostly formed words. The eyes were compound, multifaceted, currently directed at me with an expression that, if I was reading Karathan effect correctly, and I'd had practice, was about as warm as a quarterly tax audit. Documents, said Prathai's vow. I held out the passport. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. Prathai's vow took the passport with one lower arm, ran it across the scanning surface, and then went very, very still. The console made a sound I hadn't heard it make for anyone else in the queue behind me, or the hundreds of travelers I'd watched process through before me. A low, 3-tone sequence, almost musical, rising at the end like a question asked by something that already knew the answer. The upper pair of arms folded against the body. The compound eyes recalibrated. I could see the multifaceted surfaces shift as they adjusted focus. Prathai's vow stood. Not metaphorically, not the slight lean forward of someone reaching for something. The Karathan officer, who had processed approximately 800 travelers in the last 6 hours without once shifting from the seated position, rose from the chair, all 4 limbs engaged. The body went from processing posture to something that, in Karathan physical vocabulary, I could only describe as full formal attention. Spine extended, arms at specific angles, the weight distributed in a way that communicated deliberateness. Then Prathai's vow bowed. Not a nod, not the brief acknowledgement dip I'd seen them give the Travari envoy 3 spaces ahead of me in the queue. A full, deliberate inclination of the turret neck, the upper body following, held for a count of 3 seconds. I knew enough Karathan social grammar to know that a held bow of 3 seconds was addressed to a recognized treaty power. I'd seen it once before, on a documentary feed about the Concordat's annual assembly, when a senior delegate acknowledged the seating of a new foundational member. I stared. Prathai's vow straightened, met my eyes with the compound gaze, and said, "One moment, please," in a tone I had never once heard used in an immigration queue, then reached under the desk and pressed something I couldn't see. Lights changed somewhere overhead. The ambient hum of the station shifted pitch slightly, the way it does when a ventilation system reroutes or a subsystem activates. Something in the periphery of the hall changed. I didn't catch it immediately, but several travelers near me did, and I felt the queue shift its attention in small, controlled ways. 2 security officers arrived in under 90 seconds. They were Grenthai, a species I associated primarily with crowd control, mining operations, and moving heavy things efficiently. Built like defensive linemen wrapped in natural armor plating, with reinforced shoulder structures and chests that looked like they'd been designed to ignore being hit. They took up positions on either side of me, not threatening, not the posture of people detaining someone, more like the posture of people assigned to accompany someone who requires accompaniment. An escort, they were an escort. "What's happening?" I said to Prathai's Val. "You will be taken to the consul's receiving room," Prathai's Val said. The tone was the same careful, precise register you'd use with someone you had specific and formal obligations toward. "The consul wishes to address your transit directly." "Is there a problem with my passport?" The pause that followed was not a processing delay. It was the pause of someone navigating around something they had specific reasons not to say directly. "The consul will explain," Prathai's Val said, and handed my passport back with both upper arms, which in Karathan protocol was the method of returning an object to someone whose status required the gesture. The two Grenthai fell in around me, not close enough to be threatening, close enough to be unambiguous. The security lighting overhead had shifted to a pattern I hadn't seen before, a thin amber pulse, very slow, moving in a directional sequence from the customs hall toward the interior of the station. The amber light was tracking us, moving ahead of us. I realized, the reason the light was moving. The Varenthes way station had been in continuous operation for 312 years, which was approximately how old the Karathan Concordat's current administrative structure was. The station wasn't large by interstellar standards. A mid-tier waypoint, Class II transit hub, servicing approximately 400 ships a day across the 23 docking rings. But it was a Concordat station, which meant it operated under Concordat law, Concordat protocol, and the accumulated weight of Concordat precedent, which was the kind of legal ecosystem that had been fossilizing around itself for 3 centuries, and was now largely impervious to the weather of recent history. Earth had entered the Concordat 2 years ago. I say entered because that was what it felt like. We'd been standing on the outside of a building for decades, looking in through the windows, and then one day the door opened and someone said, "Fine, you've demonstrated sufficient development and made the relevant diplomatic gestures. Come in, wipe your feet." The treaty terms had taken 11 years to negotiate across 4 separate Contact-10 negotiation missions. The rights it conferred were significant, the obligations were significant, and the fine print was the kind of fine print that lawyers from 4 species had spent 5 years arguing about. And the general consensus among Earth's diplomatic corps was that we'd gotten a decent deal, all things considered, for a species that had been building radio telescopes while the Concordat was already 3 centuries old. What those treaty terms actually meant in practice, on the ground, in a corridor, with amber lights moving ahead of me and a Grenthai escort on either side, I was about to find out. The receiving room was not what I'd expected. I'd expected a holding cell, or at minimum a processing annex with uncomfortable furniture and a 2-way observation panel. What I got was a room with actual furniture in it, pieces adapted for multiple body plans, with padding, with appropriate height variations, with a window that looked out at the docking rings and the slow drift of ships beyond them against the dark. There was something on a side table that might have been refreshments. The ceiling was high and warm-lit, the kind of room where you put someone you're taking seriously. I set my bag down and sat at the table and looked at the window. The ships outside were everything. Karathan freighters with their distinctive boxy silhouette. A Solhari passenger liner, longer than anything I was used to, its hull marked with the bioluminescent stripe patterns that were apparently some kind of navigational aesthetic. A Grenthai bulk carrier that made everything else in the docking ring look like a toy. And there, at Ring 7, a ship I didn't recognize, sleek, matte black, with the kind of purposeful lines that meant private vessel, serious money, arriving in a hurry. I wondered whose it was, then I put the thought away and waited. The consul arrived 8 minutes later. The species was Varanthi, the other founding race of the Concordat, older than the Carathan in certain cosmological senses, though they would have had specific and detailed objections to the framing. The consul's name was Orath 7. I'd seen Varanthi in official contexts before, in the diplomatic footage that had circulated during the contact negotiations, in the briefing materials the ETA had given me before my first transit through Concordat space. They were tall, bilaterally asymmetric in a way that was striking up close, their mass distributed in patterns that always made them look slightly off balance to a human eye, though they never were, never even slightly. The face was smooth and pale, with deep-set sensory pits where eyes would sit in a human skull, and a mouth that was more of an aesthetic feature than a primary communication structure. Their primary language was subsonic vibration, expressed through a secondary membrane on the throat that handled the audible bandwidth for cross-species communication. The translator in my ear rendered it as a radio announcer who'd taken a sleep aid, professional, unhurried, carrying, somehow, the weight of things considered from a very long distance. "Mr. Calloway," Orath 7 said, "I apologize for the disruption to your transit. Please sit." I was already sitting. The consul did not sit. "Your passport triggered a Category 9 alert in our processing system," Orath 7 said. "I want to be direct with you about what that means, because I think the situation warrants directness." "I appreciate that." Category 9 indicates that the holder is traveling under documentation that invokes Article 17 of the Concordat Founding Charter. The membrane at the throat pulsed, the Varanthi equivalent of clearing one's voice, I'd learned. Article 17 has not been invoked in this station's processing system in over 200 years. The last time the code was triggered, it was a Carathan ministerial delegate on an interior transfer. What does Article 17 cover? It covers the rights, protections, and formal recognitions owed to citizens of species operating under a Tier 1 foundational membership in the Concordat. Another pulse. The Category 9 alert exists because Tier 1 documentation requires an entirely different processing protocol than standard transit. It was designed for a different era of the Concordat, the early era, when the distinction between founding species and contacted species was more regularly invoked. "And Earth isn't Tier 1, I said. "Earth," the consul said carefully, "was admitted to the Concordat under a standard Tier 3 provisional membership. This is the typical entry classification for newly contacted civilizations. It confers transit rights, commercial exchange rights, a set of baseline legal protections, and a phased pathway toward full membership over approximately 70 of your Earth years." "Right, I know all that. So why did my passport trigger a Tier 1 alert?" Orath 7 moved to the window. The asymmetric body settled into a stance that I was beginning to read as the Varanthi equivalent of gathering oneself. "What you may not know, what your diplomatic corps appears not to have been informed of, because the relevant archivists only discovered this 3 weeks ago and have not yet finalized the notification process, is that Earth's formal membership application, when it entered the Charter Registry, triggered an automatic cross-reference in the foundational database." I sat forward slightly. "Earth was not the first designation under which your species appeared in Concordat records," Orath 7 said. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the environmental system cycling. "What was the first?" I said. "Approximately 800 years ago, by your calendar, a Varanthi survey team operating in this sector of the outer spiral conducted a standard civilizational assessment of your world. Your species was rated per contact, no spaceflight capability, no recognized signal technology, early metallurgical development, significant biological and cognitive complexity." The membrane pulsed. "The team filed a survey report. The report assigned Earth a foundational protocol designation." "What designation?" "The third signatory species under Foundational Protocol 7. The consul turned from the window. Protocol 7 is a provision of the founding charter that predates the current membership tier structure by over a millennium. It was established in the early period of the Concordat, when the founding species were still developing the framework for identifying and eventually contacting worlds that they assessed as, the translation is imprecise, civilizationally inevitable. I turned that phrase over, civilizationally inevitable. The survey teams of that era were attempting to identify worlds whose biological and cognitive development placed them on a trajectory that would, eventually, produce spacefaring civilization regardless of external contact or interference. The Protocol 7 designation was applied to such worlds, a kind of formal recognition, centuries in advance, of what they would eventually become. And the rights attached to that designation, I said slowly. Protocol 7 designations were written under the founding charter. They predate the tier structure entirely. The consul's lower hands moved in a pattern I was starting to learn. A species designated under Protocol 7 holds, under the charter's grandfather provisions, a status equivalent to Tier 1 foundational. The provision was considered dormant. The belief was that it had been effectively superseded by modern contact protocols. But it wasn't superseded. It was archived. The legal difference is significant. I set the passport on the table and looked at it. The same slim blue booklet it had always been. 12 languages, none of them older than 2 years. The olive wreath someone had designed in a committee meeting in Geneva. The trajectory arc that was supposed to represent our reach toward space, but looked, if you tilted it right, like a fishing hook. So what you're telling me, I said, is that 800 years ago, a survey team looked at Earth, decided we were going to make it, classified us at the founding level and filed the paperwork. That is essentially correct. And then that paperwork sat in a database for 800 years. The record was classified as dormant under the protocols for non-contact civilizational designations. It would have remained so except that Earth's active membership application cross-referenced against the Charter Registry, which flagged the existing designation, which triggered a comparison review, which found that we've been carrying a Tier 1 classification for 8 centuries that nobody knew about. The consul's sensory pits moved. The review is still in process. The legal determination has not been finalized. But the scanner read the Earth designation, found the Protocol 7 record, and issued a Category 9 alert. Correct. Which is what the Carathan officer was responding to. The Protocol 9 response guidelines require that any holder of documentation that invokes a Tier 1 or equivalent foundational status be addressed with the formal recognition posture and escalated directly to the station's senior diplomatic authority. The consul moved back toward the table. The officer was following procedure correctly. It was the procedure that was unexpected. I picked up the passport again. I looked at the olive wreath. 800 years. Someone in a longship had pointed instruments at a blue planet full of people who were still working with iron and had written, "These ones are going to make it." Had checked the highest box, because that's what their assessment instruments had told them to check, had filed it and moved on to the next world. And then 800 years had passed, and we'd split the atom and walked on our moon and launched our voices into the dark on radio waves, and then microwave arrays, and then tight beam signals, and eventually one day got the call back, the one we'd been half waiting for and half afraid to want too much. And we'd negotiated for 11 years, and we'd printed the passports with the olive wreaths. And in a database somewhere on the station, a flag had been set for 800 years, waiting for something to read it. What does this mean for my transit? I asked. That is what I need to discuss with you, the consul said. Specifically, I need to tell you what else the review found. Orath 7 sat down. The asymmetric body settled into the chair with the care of someone carrying something they've been holding for a while. I want to be direct, the consul said. And I want to be direct because you are, from what I have been able to review in the last several hours, someone who will eventually discover everything I am about to tell you regardless of whether I tell you now, and it will go better for both of us if I tell you now. I appreciate that, I said. Also, that's the most diplomatic way anyone's ever told me. They think I'm going to be a problem. Something happened in the Varanthe face. It was subtle, the sensory pitch shifted, the throat membrane moved in a pattern I didn't have vocabulary for. I decided to interpret it as the equivalent of an involuntary almost smile and moved on. The implications of the Protocol 7 designation, if confirmed, are significant, Orath 7 said. Tier 1 status affects not only transit rights but commercial rights, diplomatic standing, representation in the Concordat Assembly, and a range of treaty provisions that have historically been reserved for founding and senior founding species. The commercial implications alone, the renegotiation of trade agreements, the adjustment of fee differential structures, the review of licensing arrangements, are substantial. How substantial? We have identified 47 active commercial agreements involving Earth-based entities that were negotiated under terms predicated on Earth's Tier 3 status. Under Tier 1 equivalency, those terms would be reclassifiable. The lower hands moved. Additionally, there are entities currently operating within Concordat commercial space whose arrangements with Earth-based contractors were specifically structured to take advantage of the tier differential. I recognized what that meant in plain language. I've been auditing freight manifests long enough to know what "structured to take advantage of" translated to. Someone's been overcharging us, I said. The consul did not agree. The consul also did not disagree. There are members, Orath 7 said carefully, whose current commercial arrangements with Earth-affiliated entities are governed by provisions that allow senior-tier operators to negotiate preferential terms when contracting with provisional or lower-tier members. If Earth's tier status were reclassified, those provisions would not apply retroactively or prospectively to those arrangements. Who are we talking about? The most significant entity, the consul said, after a pause that had the weight of a decision behind it, currently holding operational authority over 3 commercial processing decks on this way station, operating under preferential licensing agreements with Earth-based freight auditing contractors, including the firm you are contracted through, is Archon Velith Soren. The name landed the way it was intended to. I'd known that name since my first week of working in Concordat-adjacent commercial space. Velith Soren was Karathan, and not the career civil servant kind of Karathan, the lineage kind, the kind whose family had been operating commercial infrastructure in this transit corridor since before Earth had invented the printing press. The Archon's consolidated holdings covered processing rights, transit licensing, and commercial administrative authority across a significant fraction of the way station corridor, including, yes, the contracts that govern the processing fees paid by Earth-based freight auditing contractors, including the contracts that governed my salary structure. How long has the review team known about the Protocol 7 designation? I asked. 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, nobody informed Earth's diplomatic corps. The notification process requires internal confirmation of the legal determination before external parties are briefed. This is standard procedure. Written when? A pause. The notification protocol was last revised approximately 300 years ago. I looked at the consul for a moment, and in 3 weeks, nobody also informed Archon Velith Soren. A longer pause. The lower hands were very still. I am not in a position to comment on what information may or may not have been shared with commercial entities prior to today. The ship at Ring 7 came back to my mind. The matte black hull, the purposeful lines, the hurried arrival. Archon Velith Soren is on the station, I said. It wasn't a question. The consul's sensory pitch shifted. The Archon's vessel docked at Ring 7 approximately 2 hours ago. So 3 weeks of information management, and the moment a human passport triggered a Category 9 alert, the Archon had moved. Fast. Faster than the notification process had reached Earth. "I'd like access to the documentation," I said. "I beg your pardon." The Protocol 7 filing, the original survey record, the charter registration entry, all of it. I set the passport on the table. Under Article 17, which you've told me my passport invokes, the holder of a Tier 1 document has the right to access any Concordat administrative record pertaining to their species treaty status. I'd also like copies of the commercial licensing agreements governing the processing decks on this station, specifically the ones that involve Earth-based contractor relationships. Those are proprietary commercial documents, which fall under Concordat transparency provisions when they are material to a dispute regarding a member's treaty tier classification. Article 41. Commercial arrangements whose terms are predicated on a classification that is under examination are subject to administrative review upon request of any party to the dispute. I'd read every appendix. There'd been nothing else to do on the outbound transit. I'm a party to the dispute. I'm requesting. The consul looked at me for a long moment. "You are familiar with Article 41, Orcs 7 said. "I read the treaty." "Most people do not read the appendices." "I know, but most people aren't auditing freight in Concordat space on behalf of an organization whose tier status might be wrong. When I took this contract, I read everything." The membrane pulsed. The lower hands moved in a slow, deliberate pattern that I was beginning to read as the Varanthi equivalent of making a decision you've already made and are now formally executing. "I'll have the documents prepared," Orcs 7 said. "The room is yours for as long as you need it. I'll also have the commissary send something. You've been in that queue for several hours." "Thank you," I paused. "What's the beverage you serve here, the warm one?" "I've seen it on other visits." "It is called, approximately translated, the thing that settles the water. A Varanthi preparation. We serve it when we wish someone to feel at ease." I filed that away for later. That sounds good. The documents arrived 2 hours later, delivered by an attaché who bowed on the way in, set the files carefully on the table, and bowed on the way out. I spread them across the table and went to work. The Protocol 7 survey record was 812 years old, rendered in early Concordat administrative notation, with a translation overlay that made it read like a legal document from a civilization that had given the concept of bureaucracy 9 centuries to mature. Earth was designated KT7, Alpha 3, the third world to receive the Protocol 7 classification in the 7th sector of the Charter Survey Grid. The survey notes described a world exhibiting confirmed type IV biological complexity, confirmed type I cognitive architecture, observable social organizational structure suggesting accelerating developmental trajectory, estimated time to spaceflight capability 300 to 800 cycles. They'd looked at us and written that down, 3 to 800 cycles. We'd made it in 400 and change. And then, at the bottom of the survey notation, under the field marked classification, third signatory species under Foundational Protocol 7. Someone 8 centuries ago had checked the highest box because that's what their instruments said to check. It had taken 12 minutes for a survey team in orbit to assess humanity and determine that we were the kind of civilization that would one day be at the table. And then they'd filed it. I sat with that for a while. There's a particular feeling I get sometimes when I'm deep in a manifest, and I find the thing that explains everything else. Not triumph, not even satisfaction exactly, more like the sensation of a room coming into focus, all the shapes that had been ambiguous resolving into furniture, the proportions of the space finally readable, everything that had seemed confusing turning out to have been logical all along, just from a vantage point you hadn't occupied yet. That was the feeling sitting in that room on the Varenthes way station, holding an 800-year-old survey record about my own species. They had looked at us, at the fires we'd built and the stories we'd told around them and the tools we'd made and the structures we'd put up against the weather and each other. They'd run their instruments, whatever instruments an 8th-century-old survey team used in whatever ship from whatever civilization had given the Concordat its philosophical architecture, and they'd written their report. And the report had said, yes, these ones, this kind. The cognitive architecture, the social complexity, the adaptability index, the problem-solving signatures, all of it adding up to the same conclusion. Civilizationally inevitable. I thought about all the things that had happened between that survey and this moment, the centuries in between, the things we'd done to each other and the things we'd built and the things we'd lost and the long, slow, improbable climb from iron to orbit. They hadn't known any of that when they wrote the report. They couldn't have. They'd only seen the beginning of it, the very first movements of something they recognized as a pattern they'd seen before. And they'd written it down and checked the box and filed it away and trusted the pattern to do what patterns do. 400 years later, approximately, we'd cracked the atom. They'd estimated 3 to 800. We'd done it in 4. I thought, I wonder if anyone on that survey team is still alive. Some species lived a very long time. I thought, I wonder if they know they were right. Then I turned to the licensing agreements. The commercial structure was, once you had all the pieces in front of you, not particularly subtle. Velithsoren Consolidated Holdings held operational licenses for Decks 7, 12, and 14 of the Commercial Processing Complex, granted under a Concordat Commercial Framework article that permitted senior-tier operators to negotiate preferential rate licensing with provisional or lower-tier member entities. The preferential rate worked in one direction. The senior-tier operator got reduced operational overhead. The provisional members' contractors paid a fee premium built into the processing structure, not labeled as a premium, labeled as a standard rate, defined by the tier differential. The differential was 40%. Earth-based contractors, including my firm, paid 40% more in processing fees than an equivalent service provided through or contracted by a Tier 2 or Tier 1 member. 40%, built into every contract, stamped as industry standard, described in the agreements I'd signed without questioning as favorable for a Tier 3 entity. I did the math. Then I did it again because the first number seemed too large. Then I pulled out my tablet and did it a third time with a calculator function. The number was the same each time. 11 years of Tier 3 differential across the entire ETA commercial portfolio, 40% on every processing contract. The aggregate was a figure large enough that, when I wrote it out numerically, I wrote it twice to make sure I hadn't added a zero. I hadn't added a zero. I wrote a message to the ETA legal department. It was long. I flagged it urgent. I attached the Protocol 7 survey record and the relevant charter articles and the licensing agreements and my preliminary calculation. Then I sent it on the station's standard comm relay, which would put it on Earth in approximately 11 hours. Then I sat back and looked at the docking window. Outside, the Carathan commercial carrier at Ring 7 was fully lit now. Someone was loading it, or unloading it, or moving its manifests around. I watched it for a while and thought about manifests, and what they meant when they were wrong, and what they meant when they were right, and what they meant when they had always been right and nobody had looked. The thing that settles the water arrived while I was thinking. It was warm and tasted like citrus, and something I still couldn't identify, and it didn't settle anything, but it was good. I drank it slowly and thought about the ship at Ring 7. 6 hours ago, an alert had gone out, not to Earth, to somewhere in the Concordat's internal administrative network, and within hours, a private vessel had docked, the kind of private vessel that cost more than most Earth-based commercial operations generated in a year. The kind you only moved that fast if you had advance notice of something significant and a strong interest in how it resolved. 3 weeks of sitting on the Protocol 7 discovery. 3 weeks of internal review and notification procedures that had not, in 3 weeks, managed to send a single message to Earth's diplomatic corps. I was a freight auditor, not a diplomat, not a lawyer, not a political analyst. I'd spent 11 years tracking the movement of things between places and making sure the numbers that described those movements were accurate. But you couldn't do that work in Concordat commercial space without learning, very quickly, how information moved here and why. The Concordat was not corrupt in any simple sense. It was something more interesting than that. It was old. 300 years old in its current form. The tier structure, the commercial frameworks, the treaty provisions, all of it had been built incrementally, each piece making sense in the context of the pieces that existed when it was added. The whole structure had accreted around itself until it was the kind of architecture that wasn't designed so much as grown, and things that grew for 300 years without pruning tended to benefit the parts of the organism that had been there longest. The Concordat's founding members had been there longest. That wasn't a conspiracy, it was just gravity. What was interesting, and what I was sitting here thinking about, with my warm beverage and my tablet full of notes, was that whoever had written the Concordat's founding charter had also been a founding member. They'd written the tier structure. They'd written the commercial provisions. They'd written Protocol 7. They'd written Article 17 and Article 41 and the grandfather provisions and the notification protocols and all of it. And somewhere in all of that writing, they had also included the provision that said, a species designated under Protocol 7 holds foundational level status, even if that species doesn't exist yet in a form that can hold anything. Whoever wrote that had been thinking about something the founding structure was for, not just what it was. They'd been thinking about what kind of civilization they wanted to build, and they'd written in, right at the beginning, a clause that said, when the ones we assessed arrive, they arrive as equals. I thought about that for a while. The thing that settles the water didn't settle anything, but it was very good. The meeting between the consul and Archon Velith Sorin lasted 4 hours. I know this because I finished reviewing the licensing agreements and wrote up a preliminary analysis and sent a third message to the ETA legal team, and then read through the Protocol 7 survey record twice more, and reviewed the relevant charter articles, and made additional notes, and ordered another beverage, and the attaché came to get me when the 4 hours were up. Velith Sorin was, in person, a different order of thing than I'd been prepared for, older than the customs officer, or carrying age differently. The carapace was deep matte, the surface of something very long-lived. The 4 arms moved with the economy of someone for whom efficiency had become an aesthetic. The body language was the very specific stillness of beings that have held authority long enough that they no longer need to perform it. The upper pair of arms were folded in the Carathan posture I'd identified as I am about to be reasonable in a way that is ultimately favorable to me. Mr. Calloway, Velith Sorin said, the translator made the voice warm. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Archon, I said. I understand you've had an eventful arrival. Routine transit, I said. The station systems were just thorough. Indeed. The Archon moved to the other side of the table and stood, not sitting, not close, just repositioning with the casual authority of someone accustomed to choosing their spatial relationship to conversations. I've had an opportunity to review the situation with the consul. It's a fascinating historical footnote. Charter records from the founding era can be imprecise, and these old designations occasionally surface in ways that require interpretation. The Protocol 7 record seemed precise to me, I said. Detailed survey notes, correct biological and cognitive classifications, proper charter registration. Whoever did that assessment knew what they were doing. These things have a way of becoming complicated over time, Velith Sorin said. The warmth in the translated voice was the warmth of something that had been professionally calibrated. I want to offer a practical perspective, Mr. Calloway. The Protocol 7 question is ultimately a matter for legal scholars, for charter archivists and diplomatic bodies to resolve through the established review process, which, as you know, moves very carefully and takes considerable time. The treaty framework Earth negotiated 2 years ago is robust and well considered. It has served Earth's commercial interests meaningfully. Destabilizing that framework by pursuing archaic charter provisions of uncertain current applicability benefits no one, and introduces disruption into relationships that took years to build. I looked at the Archon for a moment. Are you suggesting that Earth shouldn't pursue the Protocol 7 claim? I said. I'm suggesting that reasonable parties often determine that the costs of disruption outweigh the theoretical advantages of pursuing historical technicalities. I picked up my tablet from the table. In the licensing agreements governing your consortium's commercial operation on the station, I said, the ones that use Earth's Tier 3 status as the basis for the processing fee differential, I've calculated the aggregate differential paid by Earth-based contractors over the 11 years since the ETA's commercial engagement in this corridor began. I read the number. The consul's lower hands moved. The Archon's upper arms did not unfold. The stillness that answered the number was the stillness of something very practiced at not reacting. That figure, Velith Soren said, represents legally contracted fee structures under a recognized commercial framework. Every agreement was executed with full transparency and mutual consent, under a framework predicated on a tier classification that may be incorrect. May be. As I said, the review process will take time. In the interim, current frameworks remain operative. Of course, I said, I'm not asking for anything immediate. I'm a freight auditor. I find discrepancies in manifests and document what they are and send the documentation to people whose job it is to determine the implications. I set the tablet down. The ETA legal team has everything now. The Protocol 7 record, the charter articles, the licensing agreements, and my preliminary analysis. They'll determine what the implications are and at what pace to pursue them. The folded arms did something I didn't have a name for. These things take time, Velith Soren said again. The warmth had gotten slightly more instrumental. The Concordat review process is thorough, but it is slow. In the interim, I want to be clear that there are channels available for a constructive resolution that doesn't require the disruption of a full charter review. What kind of channels? The Concordat has provisions for negotiated settlements in tier classification disputes, commercial adjustments, fee restructuring on a prospective basis, without the complication of retroactive claims. The Archon's lower hands moved in a slow pattern. A reasonable settlement could be completed in a fraction of the time a formal charter review would require, and would allow the commercial relationships that currently function well to continue functioning well. I looked at the Archon, then at the consul. The consul's lower hands were very still. I understand what you're describing, I said. You're describing an arrangement where Earth accepts a settlement for future fees in exchange for not pursuing the retroactive calculation. A pragmatic resolution, which would mean Earth agrees that the last 11 years of overcharging were fine. The word sat there. The Archon's expression, such as I could read it, went to something very smooth. The fee differential was legally specified under existing framework agreements. Under a framework that was built on a tier classification that may be wrong, I said. If the classification is wrong, the framework it supports is also wrong. You can't settle the framework without addressing the classification, and you can't address the classification without addressing everything the classification touched. I picked up the tablet. I've sent everything to the ETA legal team. That decision is theirs to make, not mine. I'm just the auditor. You sent it before you spoke to us, the Archon said. The warmth had gone out of the translated voice. I sent it when I had the documentation in hand. That's standard procedure. You had the documentation for 2 hours before we met. I'm fast, I said. The console's throat membrane did something. I categorically refused to look at it because if I did I was going to smile, and this was not a moment to smile. These things take time, Vilithsoren said one more time. Slower now, like a phrase being considered from a new angle. They do, I agreed. 11 years isn't that long in charter terms. The Protocol 7 record is 800 years old. The Concordat has been managing these kinds of questions for 3 centuries. I'm sure the review process will be thorough. I picked up my bag. I appreciate the time, Archon. The folded arms did the thing I didn't have a name for. I filed it for later. In the interim, I have a connecting ship to catch. I looked at the console. Has my transit documentation been finalized under Protocol 9? The membrane pulsed. There is a procedure for processing transit documentation under Category 9, which Prathais can complete at the customs booth, I said, since the relevant documentation now exists. The consul looked at the Archon. The Archon looked at me. The upper arms shifted. Yes, Oreth7 said. Prathais can complete the transit documentation. Then I think we're done here. I stood, picked up my bag, tucked the passport into my breast pocket. Thank you for the room, Consul, and for the beverage. I still don't fully know what's in it. It is the thing that settles the water, Oreth7 said. Did it work? The sensory pits shifted. The throat membrane moved in a way I was starting to read as reluctant amusement. Apparently not, the consul said. Prathais was still at the customs booth. The queue had thinned to a handful of travelers at this hour, the particular patience of people transiting at odd hours, the quiet that settles into big spaces when the crowd has moved through. The officer looked up when I approached. Mr. Calloway, Prathais said. I need my transit documentation finalized, I said, under Protocol 9. Yes, the console was accessed with the same precise key sequence. 1 moment. The moment lasted 30 seconds. The console made none of the sounds it had made before. The documentation that came out of the processing slot was standard format, thin printed transit authorization, time-stamped, route confirmed, valid for 30 days. The same kind of document anyone in the queue behind me would get. Prathais handed it across the window. You're cleared for transit, the officer said. Your connection departs from Ring 3. Thank you. I picked up the authorization and was about to step away when I stopped. One more thing, I said. The Sulhari merchant who was processed before me today. They were told to stand in the secondary queue for a formatting irregularity. Prathais was still. The formatting issue, I said. Was it an actual irregularity, or was it a difference in date notation? A pause, the kind that has weight behind it. Sulhari calendar notation uses an inverted day-month sequence. The transit permit was valid. The issue was a notation convention, not an error. So the secondary queue designation was an error in classification on my part, Prathais said, very quietly, with the particular precision of someone stating something they've already admitted to themselves. Formatting conventions that differ from Concordat standard notation are not irregularities. No, I said, they're not. The lower arms moved across the console. I will issue a correction to the Sulhari merchant's transit file. The restriction will be removed. Thank you, I said. I walked away from the window. Behind me, Prathais called the next traveler in the queue. The voice was the same as it had been for 40 years. Precise, professional, governing itself by procedure. The customs hall smelled of ozone and the unidentifiable something sweet. The security lighting had returned to standard. Through the panoramic viewports at the far end, the docking rings were bright against the dark. I walked toward Ring 3. The message from the ETA legal department arrived while I was waiting to board. It was short. Lawyers, when they have something significant to say, often get very economical with language. It confirmed receipt of all documentation. It confirmed that a formal review request had been filed with the Concordat Charter Registry. 3 partner firms were on immediate notice. An interagency working group was being convened within 24 hours. The last line said, "Marcus, what did you find?" It wasn't a question. I wrote back, "The paperwork, mostly someone else's from a long time ago. Turns out we've been in here longer than anyone thought." Then I boarded the ship and found my bunk, and lay there looking at the curve of the hull. I've thought about that day a lot in the years since. Not the legal outcome. That took 3 years, which is apparently fast for a Concordat charter dispute, and I leave the summary of it to the lawyers who handled it. Something involving retroactive tier reclassification, prospective commercial renegotiation, and a set of terms described as enhanced foundational standing that resulted in, among other things, Earth gaining 2 seats in the Concordat Assembly that our Tier 3 status hadn't entitled us to. I know the number that appeared in the settlement, too. It's a number I'm not supposed to discuss, but it had the same general magnitude as the number I'd calculated that evening in the consul's receiving room, the one I'd written out twice. What I think about is smaller things. I think about the way Prathizvow stood up, the 4-second sequence, the scan, the tone, the stillness, and then the rising from a chair where they'd processed 800 people without once rising, and the bow that lasted 3 seconds. There was something in that moment I keep returning to, not because it was dramatic, though it was, but because it was automatic. Prathizvow hadn't made a judgment call, hadn't decided, had simply followed a procedure that was 4 seconds old and 800 years in the making, a procedure that had been waiting, dormant, for a passport to wake it up. I think about the Archon ship at Ring 7, the hurried docking, the 4-hour meeting, the very warm translated voice offering pragmatic resolutions. I think about the 3-week gap between discovery and notification, and what that gap represented in terms of who knew what and when, and I try to be fair about it. The Concordat is old. Its procedures are old. The pace at which it moves is the pace of something that has been moving for 3 centuries and has calcified its rhythms into institutional form. I don't think it was simple malice. I think it was the much more pervasive thing. The assumption that the framework currently in place was the framework that would remain in place, and that if something had been a certain way for 11 years, it would continue being that way, and that the cost of disruption outweighed the theoretical benefits of a historical technicality. The word they kept using, technicality. I've thought about that word a lot. An 800-year-old survey record, carefully completed, properly registered, legally sound in every particular, waiting in a database for the species it described to arrive and claim it. That's a technicality. A date notation difference on a Sulhari transit permit that renders it void without a review that won't happen. That's procedure. The asymmetry is interesting, if you spend enough time with manifests to find that kind of thing interesting. I do. The connecting transit was 12 hours to Varenthis Station Prime. I spent most of it reviewing the freight manifests I was technically still being paid to audit, which felt, given everything, like returning to a familiar scale after working in a suddenly much larger room. Around hour 9, a message came from a sender I didn't recognize, a Sulhari address, the distinctive triple domain notation. The restriction was removed, it said. My transit has been authorized. I don't know what you did, but thank you. Also, it continued, what were you carrying in that passport? I looked at the ceiling of the bunk for a moment. Nothing extra, I wrote back. Just documentation. Turns out the documentation was enough. I put the tablet on the shelf and looked at the whole curve above me, and beyond the hole the dark, and beyond the dark the stars. We'd been looking at them for most of our history. Watching them, measuring them, naming them in dozens of languages and writing stories about them, and aiming our instruments at them, and eventually sending our voices out on radio waves and tight beam signals. And eventually, in person, in ships like this one, through customs queues that smelled of ozone and the unidentifiable something sweet. 800 years ago, someone in a long ship had pointed instruments at Earth, had looked at the people down there with their iron tools and their first cities and their enormous complicated history that they were barely getting started on, and had written in the administrative notation of a civilization we wouldn't meet for 8 centuries. These ones will make it. Had checked the founding level box, had filed it correctly and moved on. I tried to imagine them. The survey team, whatever species they were, the Varanthi were the most likely candidate, given that the consul had mentioned their survey operations of that era, but I didn't know for certain. I tried to imagine their ship, which would have been old even by the standards of 8 centuries ago, and their instruments and the quiet work of assessment. Looking at Earth and running their analyses and writing their conclusions. KT7, Alpha 3. Type IV biological complexity, Type I cognitive architecture, civilizationally inevitable. 12 minutes, the record had implied. 12 minutes in orbit to reach that conclusion. I'd been standing in a customs queue for 3 hours. The math was slightly humbling. But they'd been right. Whatever instruments they'd used, whatever framework they'd applied, they'd looked at what we were and seen what we'd become. Not the specifics. They couldn't have seen the specifics, the atom bomb and the moon landing and the radio telescopes and the 11 years of negotiation and the passports and the freight auditors, but the shape of it, the trajectory, the pattern of a civilization that, once it started moving, didn't stop. There's a word for that in the Earth languages I know, in several of them. Stubborn, persistent, relentless. The kind of species that, when it finds a wall in front of it, starts looking for the door, and if it doesn't find the door, it looks for the window, and if it doesn't find the window, it starts figuring out whether the wall itself is load-bearing and what it would take to go through it. Apparently the survey team had a word for it too in their notation. A technical term translated approximately as civilizationally inevitable. That meant, you're going to try to stop this, and it's not going to work. They hadn't even had us in mind when they wrote it. It was just the accurate description of a pattern they'd identified, a technical assessment, a box checked. And history had validated it, not through any single moment of triumph, not through any one great act of defiance, but through the accumulated weight of 8 centuries of our species doing exactly what the survey team had noted we would do. Getting up, trying again, finding the fine print, reading the appendices. Standing in the queue. I thought about the Solhari merchant looking at the ceiling and saying good luck. I thought about what it would mean over time if the Protocol 7 finding held, and I thought it would hold because the filing was sound and the charter language was clear, and good legal work is hard to unwrite even when people would prefer it to be undone. I thought about the other 11 members whose arrangements would be affected, and the 47 commercial agreements, and the long, slow work of renegotiation that was going to be very good for several law firms and very uncomfortable for several commercial dynasties. I thought about the consul's beverage, and the way the amber lights had moved ahead of us through the station. I thought about the notification process that had taken 3 weeks and still hadn't reached Earth, and the private ship that had docked in hours. Information moved fast when people wanted it to. The rest was procedure. And in a database somewhere on a Varenthes way station, a flag sat in a different state than it had this morning, no longer dormant. Cross-referenced and cited and attached to a legal review that would take 3 years and produce results that would outlast everyone currently living on this station. The scanner had read the passport. I hadn't done anything except stand in a line and hand over the documentation that Earth had spent 11 years earning the right to carry. The passport had done the rest. The passport, and 8 centuries of careful archival work by a survey team who'd known, even then, what we were going to become. We had always been in here. We just had to show up to find out. The ship moved through the dark. Outside the hull, the stars did what stars always do. They burned, and stayed where they were, and waited for whoever was coming toward them next. We'd been one of those whoever's for a long time. We were still one. The difference now was we knew our way around. We knew which boxes had been checked and which articles applied and which appendices to read. We knew to read the appendices. I closed my eyes. The ship moved. We moved with it. 40 light years from home, and right where we were supposed to be.